Snow whispered along the roof of the cabin, its breath slow and steady like a sleeping beast. The trees stood sentinel, pines tall and still, their needles collecting the weight of winter in silvery silence. Inside, the warmth clung only to the center of the room, where the stove hummed faintly and a battered kettle murmured in a voice no one listened to anymore. Clara Vale moved like someone who had learned not to disturb the air. She wore her solitude like an old shawl, threadbare but wrapped tight, comforting in its predictability. Her hands, rough with work and time, folded laundry in the dim light of the hearth. A button was missing on one of her flannel shirts. She turned it over slowly, as if the fabric might confess where it had gone. The cabin wasn't large, but it had good bones. Her late husband had chosen the plot, though it was she who built the home. After he passed, quietly, as he'd lived, vanishing from the world the same way he'd slipped through their marriage, she hadn't changed much. Just moved things closer to the stove and let the dust settle where it pleased. She spoke aloud only to the fire. Outside, the storm had already begun to turn. The wind, once furious, now whimpered. Branches creaked under the weight of ice, groaning like tired old men. Clara stepped to the window, more out of habit than curiosity. She liked knowing where the world was. That's when she saw the boot print. Just one, stamped deep in the snow by the door, half filled with frost. Her spine straightened, breath caught behind her teeth. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Only watched. It wasn't the print that frightened her. It was what came next. The door, unlatched and closed only by the weight of snow, shifted inward a crack. Cold bled through the opening like a slow sigh. Clara reached for the rifle above the hearth. It was old. Her father's. She hadn't fired it in years, but she cradled it now with muscle memory that came from something deeper than practice, something like survival. She stepped softly, each floorboard groaning beneath her weight, as if mourning what might come next. With her fingers tight on the barrel, she pushed the door open. The man collapsed forward onto her floor. He fell like a felled tree, limp, unresisting, already part of the ground. Blood had crusted in a line down his temple. His coat, once a soldier's blue, was torn and soaked through with snow. One boot was missing. His breath was shallow, steam ghosting from cracked lips. Clara stood over him, gun trembling now in her hands, not from fear, but from the shock of having the world crack open without warning. He made no move toward her, just lay there like something left behind. She knelt slowly. Her eyes scanned for weapons, threats, lies. All she found was frostbite and bruises. The kettle whined behind her like a child afraid of the dark. She pulled the door shut, not fully knowing why. By morning, the town would know. Out here, nothing stayed secret, not for long. Still, she hauled him toward the hearth. It took everything she had. The man was heavy in the way only the unconscious can be, all dead weight and broken promises. She laid him near the stove and peeled off his coat. His shirt beneath was stiff with dried blood, and his ribs looked wrong, caved inward slightly like a barn after a storm. A jagged scar crossed one wrist. His hands were rough, farm rough, not outlaw rough. She made note of that without meaning to. By the time the fire had thawed some of his color back, he stirred. A groan, soft and pained, leaked from his throat. Clara sat in the rocking chair, rifle still across her lap. His eyes opened. They were not wild, not cruel, just tired, wary. He looked at her, then at the rifle, then back. "You're in my cabin," she said, voice flat as the plains. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. She poured water from the kettle into a tin cup, held it out. He reached for it, but winced, ribs. She stepped forward and helped him lift it. Their hands brushed. His skin was cold as river stone. "You got a name?" she asked. He took a sip, then another, then whispered, "Don't recall." She didn't believe him. Not fully, but it didn't matter. Not yet. "You got a reason for bleeding on my floor?" No answer. Outside, the wind had died. Snowflakes drifted slowly now like ash. Stillness clung to the world, heavy and sharp. She stood, looked down at him. "You can stay the night. But come morning, you leave." He didn't nod, didn't protest, just leaned his head back against the leg of the stove, eyes closing again like he was sinking under a black river. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat with the rifle in her lap until the sky began to warm behind the trees. By mid-morning, the sheriff came. He knocked twice before entering, boots loud on her wooden steps. Sheriff Boone was a wide man, one of those who took up more space than he needed and more than he'd earned. He paused when he saw the man on the floor, raised a brow. "Well," he said, "that the fella?" Clara nodded, jaw tight. Boone stepped closer, nudging the man's boot with his own. "Found him here, did you? On the floor. He say who he is?" "Said he didn't know." Boone sucked air through his teeth. "That's so." He crouched, looked the man over like he was choosing livestock. Then he stood and turned to Clara. "You know what this looks like?" She didn't answer. "It looks like he was here before. Maybe he's your man. Maybe ran off. Now he's back and you're playing dumb. That's not what happened. Doesn't matter. Word's already out. Folks saw your chimney smoking late. Someone saw you dragging him in." Clara's pulse thudded in her ears. "I didn't drag him in. He collapsed." "Still." Boone shrugged. "Town want it made proper. Ain't right for a woman to keep a man overnight without a name or a ring. Especially not one half dead." Clara stared at him, the shape of his face, the smug certainty carved into it like stone. "I'm not marrying a stranger. Not asking you to. Town is. And the preacher. And your neighbors. And me." He shifted his belt. "You don't. We bring him in for trespass. For vagrancy. For suspicion." She glanced at the man, unconscious again. He looked more boy than man in the flicker of firelight. Younger than her maybe. Worn thinner by life. Boone stepped toward the door. "You do what you want, Miss Vale. But this town ain't kind of stories that don't end the way folks like. You say he's not yours, they'll make it harder on both of you." He left without another word. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The door closed behind him with a thud like finality. Clara stood still, arms at her sides. The silence pressed in. The fire popped. She looked at the man. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. But now, without permission, without consent, without choice, he was hers. At least in the eyes of a town that believed in tidy explanations and forced endings. And she was no longer alone, whether she wanted to be or not. She sat down slowly in the rocker, eyes fixed on the stranger, on the stove, on the snow beyond the window. Something had changed. Something had begun. He woke 2 mornings later with a shudder so quiet it almost went unnoticed, save for the soft clink of the tin cup he knocked over in the act. Clara had been slicing dried venison by the stove, her back to him, but the sound drew her eyes. She turned slowly, blade still in hand. The man, her husband now, if one believed the paper the preacher scrawled in hurried ink the day before, was propped against the cabin wall, breath shallow, eyes blinking at the beams above as though they might fall. Clara didn't speak. She watched. Let the silence stretch like taffy between them, pulling and pulling until it nearly snapped. He looked over at her, weakly, and tried to speak again. This time something came, rough, dry, the echo of a voice rather than a voice itself. "You shouldn't be," he rasped. "I did," Clara replied. "And not for your sake." She brought him a cup of water and set it on the floor beside him. He didn't reach for it. His eyes dropped to her hands, small, scarred, calloused from work no woman was supposed to carry alone. "I'll be gone soon," he said. "No," she answered, steady and sure. "You won't." He blinked. "They signed your name to mine," she continued, her voice low and unreadable. "Tied it like a noose. Said it'd make things easier." He let out a short breath that might have been a laugh or pain. "Strange kind of easier," he said. Strange indeed. His recovery came slow. Bones don't rush to heal, especially when the spirit beneath them is weary. He moved little, ate little. His eyes watched everything. Each corner of the room, each moment Clara's hands moved across space. Not like a threat, more like someone learning the shape of quiet after years of noise. Clara never asked him again for his name. She began calling him the man, and when talking to herself, sometimes the boarder. He made no protest. His silence was like a second skin, worn and familiar. But in it, she saw something rawer than absence. Not secrecy, grief. One morning, she found him outside, barefoot in the snow, leaning against the porch beam as if testing the world's edges. His breath smoked in the cold. He looked up at the sky with a face like old paper, creased and fading. "You're going to lose those toes," she said from the doorway, arms crossed, apron dusted with ash. He didn't turn. "They already feel like they're gone. Then come inside and stop trying to finish what the bullet started." He obeyed, not out of fear, more like resignation. But that, too, was a kind of trust. Weeks passed like pages turning in a slow, winter-bound book. Snow deepened. Ice thickened on the creek. Clara mended old clothes by lamplight while the man carved little things from pine shavings, shapes that might be animals or memories, or simply the echo of a skill once used for something real. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his voice had softened, hoarse but calm, as though warmed by the cabin's hearth. Clara, who had long ago grown used to silence, now listened to it differently. Where once it had been emptiness, it now held weight. She noticed the rhythm of his breath, the way he stood slightly askew as if guarding an old wound. She saw the scars across his knuckles, the way his eyes didn't dart to doors or windows but rested in stillness, like a man no longer running. They spoke in fragments. Mornings were for small nods, evenings for single-syllable exchanges. But each word mattered. None were wasted. And slowly, something began to settle between them. Something not quite peace, not yet connection, but recognition. Like two wild things learning the other would not bite. One day, she found him patching the back step, a hammer in hand. He hadn't asked. Just did it. "You don't owe me labor," she said from the doorway. "I don't have coin," he replied. She nodded once, stepped inside. Later that night, when he placed a bowl of stew on the table without her asking, she didn't speak either. Just ate beside him in silence, the clink of spoons the only music. The town, of course, continued to whisper. Mabel, the widow who ran the boarding house and believed in polite meddling, arrived one afternoon with extra wool and dried herbs. "Thought he might need help healing," she said, setting them down. "He's healing," Clara replied, neither warm nor cold. "And you?" Clara paused, hand resting on the back of a chair. "I'm fed. I'm warm. That's enough." Mabel gave her a long look, the kind that knew things but didn't speak them aloud. "Just because they say you're his wife now," she said, voice soft, "doesn't mean you have to love him." Clara smiled, barely a crease at the edge of her mouth. "I know." Mabel left without pushing further. She was one of the few who respected boundaries, who understood that some women built walls not to keep others out, but to hold themselves in. The sheriff came again, weeks later, riding through the snow like a shadow on horseback. "Still here, is he?" Boone asked, glancing toward the cabin. "He is," Clara said, chopping firewood. "Name yet?" "No." Boone looked at her sideways. Men without names usually got reasons, and men with badges usually got suspicions. He chuckled, rubbed his jaw. "Just keep your eyes open, is all I'm saying. Town's still watching. They like a story to wrap up clean." She didn't respond. He didn't linger. That night, Clara found the man standing by the window, watching the moon rise behind the pines. She joined him in the quiet. "You ever kill someone?" she asked softly, no judgment in the words. He didn't flinch. "Yes." "War?" "Yes." "Since?" His breath caught, barely. A pause, then, "No." She nodded, looked out at the snow. "You ever hurt a woman?" He turned to her slowly. There was something fragile in his face then, no anger, no insult. Just a quiet breaking. "No," he said, "and I never will." And Clara, without knowing why, believed him. The next morning, she caught him looking at an old book on her shelf, a ledger of plants and remedies. His fingers hovered above the spine. "You read?" she asked. "A little. Long time ago." She handed it to him without ceremony. He took it like it was something valuable. Later that day, she found him copying diagrams on a scrap of wood, his handwriting neat and deliberate. She said nothing, but her heart thudded strangely in her chest. Not out of fear, out of some strange comfort. The fire crackled louder that night. Or maybe it was her heart. She wasn't sure anymore. They were still strangers, still tethered by the cruelty of custom and chance. But there, in the soft hours between dusk and dawn, Clara began to wonder what it would mean to choose what had been forced. To claim something, not because the town demanded it, but because it began to feel real. One night, as snow sighed gently outside and the stove pulsed its golden glow, she placed a second cup of tea beside his chair. He looked at it, then at her. "Thank you," he murmured. She sat across from him, hands around her own cup. "You'll tell me your name when you're ready," she said. He nodded, slow and thoughtful. And for the first time, he looked at her like a man not afraid of being known. Still, the night carried unease. Not the kind that comes with danger, but the kind that comes before a revelation. A quiet, crawling tension, like the pause before thunder. Something was coming. Clara could feel it in her bones. But for now, there was only tea and warmth, and the hush of two souls learning not to flinch. The thaw came slow, not just to the land but to the soul. Snow melted in fits, reluctant and slushy, soaking the seams of the earth. The creek, once silent and entombed in ice, began to murmur again, a hush of forgotten voices just below the surface. Trees dripped like weeping giants. The world was waking, but cautious, as if afraid of what the warmth might stir. Inside the cabin, things had shifted. It wasn't spoken. It rarely is. But the way she passed him the bread, the way he folded her shawl before setting it on the hook, these things told truths neither dared to name aloud. And yet, despite their growing nearness, a fire smoldered between them, unsaid and aching. He was stronger now, no longer bound to the cot or the crutch of silence. His shoulders, though still marked by old bruises, had filled out beneath one of her husband's shirts. His beard had come in, ragged but honest. He had started chopping wood, not because she asked, but because the act itself seemed to settle something restless inside him. Clara watched him from the porch one morning, the axe rising and falling like a pendulum counting out fate. Each swing was precise, controlled, as if, in that motion, he could tame whatever storm still raged beneath his ribs. "You could stay," she said one evening, the words dropping like stones into still water. "Not because they say you should, because you want to." He looked up from the tin bowl of stew, hands wrapped around it for warmth. "I don't know what I want," he replied, slowly, the admission heavy with truth. "Most of my life's been about running. Staying's a thing I don't remember how to do." She nodded, not with disappointment, but recognition. "You remember more than you think." And he did. He remembered the smell of cinnamon, her baking on Sundays, the way her fingers twitched when she was anxious, as if mending thread in the air. He remembered her humming low songs to herself, songs she didn't know she sang. He also remembered pain, scars that burned even in sleep. The face of a boy who looked like him, once, before war and guilt took him apart. But he didn't tell her all of that. Not yet. One late afternoon, with the sky the color of old wool and the air thick with damp, she found him beneath the lean-to behind the barn. He was hunched over, holding something wrapped in oilskin. When she drew near, he flinched, not with fear, but the kind of startled sorrow that comes when someone is seen before they are ready. "What is it?" she asked gently. He didn't speak at first. Then, with trembling fingers, he unfolded the bundle. Inside was a journal, pages worn and stained, edges curled like dried leaves. On the first page, a name written in strong, slanted hand. Samuel Eli Cutter. "My brother's," he said, voice low. Clara stood beside him, breath tight. "Where is he?" "Gone," Samuel whispered. 3 years now. Died saving my life. That day, I took his coat, his name, his place in the company. Thought it would be easier to die as him than live as me." Clara knelt beside him, hand brushing lightly over the journal. "You weren't running from the law," she said, not as a question. "No, I was running from who I used to be. A coward, a thief, a man who let his brother take the bullet meant for him." He stared ahead, eyes wet but unblinking. "I thought if I wandered long enough, wore his coat, lived small, maybe the shame would forget me." Clara's hand found his. "It didn't." "No," he said. "It never does." For a long while they stayed like that, the silence between them thick but no longer empty. Later, inside, by the fire, Clara handed him her old needle and thread. "Fix the hem," she said, handing him the flannel shirt with the missing button. "You've earned it." He laughed, soft and genuine. "That's your way of saying I belong here." "No," she said. "It's my way of saying you're not just someone who passed through." From then on, things softened. Samuel started keeping the journal again, his words now, not his brother's. He'd write by lamplight, sometimes reading passages to Clara, pieces of a life she had not lived but felt in her marrow. They shared dreams and fragments. She spoke of teaching children in a one-room schoolhouse, her voice sure and full of books. He spoke of land, planting seeds, watching things grow instead of burn. But the fire between them, the one not in the hearth, it grew. It showed itself in small moments. Her hand lingering on his shoulder a second longer. His breath catching when she tucked her hair behind her ear. Neither of them dared name it. Not yet. It was too new, too precious. Still, it burned. Then, as all tales must, Peace trembled. It came on horseback, a rider from town, dust and haste in every hoofbeat. His face pale, voice urgent. "Sheriff says you got to come. Both of you." Clara met Samuel's eyes, heart sinking. "What's happened?" "Outlaw shot a rancher. Town's on edge. Stranger like him. Folk are talking again. Say he fits the look of one they've been hunting in Kansas. A bounty on his head. Sheriff can't keep it quiet." Samuel stood, slow and calm. No fear in his face now, just resolve. Clara stepped in front of him. "You're not going. They'll come here if I don't." "Then let them." He shook his head. "You don't understand. If I hide again, it becomes true. I'm not running anymore." His hand brushed her cheek, a touch so tender it made her breath catch. "You gave me a name again," he said. "Not my brother's. Mine." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'll come with you," she said. He nodded. The sun dipped low as they rode into town. Side by side, heads high, the townsfolk parted like waves, eyes wary, voices low. Sheriff Boone stood at the gallows square, flanked by men with rifles. "Samuel Cutter," he called, voice like gravel. "Step forward." Samuel did. Clara stood close, hand on his arm. "This the man you're hunting?" Boone asked the bounty man who had come with the rider. The man peered at Samuel, frowned. "No," he said after a long moment. "The man we're after's got a scar across his left cheek and a snake tattoo on his wrist. This one's clean." Boone looked disappointed. The crowd murmured, unsure if it should feel cheated or relieved. Samuel turned, faced Clara. "You believe me now?" he whispered. "I believed you before you spoke," she replied. That night, as they returned to the cabin, no words were needed. Inside, the fire danced. The wind moaned low through the eaves. Samuel reached for her hand as they sat side by side in the chair built for one. There were no vows, no declarations, just the slow burn of trust becoming something sacred. The fire between them no longer feared. It warmed. It welcomed. And somewhere deep in the silence, a future began to take root. Spring came without ceremony. No grand awakening. Just the slow, stubborn retreat of snow, inch by inch, like a memory finally loosening its grip. The ground softened beneath tired boots. The trees whispered in new green. And the creek, once a frozen ribbon, ran full and laughing again. Inside the cabin, Clara rose before the dawn as she always had. But now there was a rhythm in her steps, a quietness that wasn't lonely. Samuel slept in the corner bed, one arm across his chest, the other flung toward where she had once lain. The space between them had vanished long ago, first in thought, then in touch, and finally in breath. What had begun in silence now moved like wind through reeds, natural, inevitable. He stirred as the kettle hissed. "You're up early," he said, voice rough with sleep. "So are the birds," she murmured, peeking out the window. "I heard one singing like it remembered something worth waking for." Samuel sat up, hair tousled, a shadow of peace softening his jaw. "They know," he said. "The season's changed." She didn't answer, but her smile was small and warm as a hearth flame. Still, even in warmth, there are shadows that linger. Boone returned one morning near the end of April, his horse slick with sweat, his eyes harder than before. "There's talk," he said, not dismounting. Kansas riders passed through, looking for the one called Cutter. Samuel stepped from the porch, shirt sleeves rolled, eyes clear. "I told you, I'm not him." Boone tilted his head. "That might not matter. There's gold on that name. Sometimes, gold speaks louder than truth." Clara came to stand beside Samuel, her hands dirty from planting. She looked at Boone not like a woman pleading, but a woman ready. "We don't owe this town any more than we've already paid." Boone's mouth twitched. He looked tired, maybe older. "I believe you," he said finally. "But belief won't stop a bullet." Then he turned, riding off without a backward glance. The peace they'd built began to fray at the edges. Samuel started keeping the rifle close again, not out of fear, but out of respect for the danger that follows silence. He walked the perimeter of the cabin before bed, taught Clara how to load and aim, just in case. "You're not leaving," she said one night, as they sat on the porch beneath a sky thick with stars. "No," he said. "If they come, they come. I'm not running." She nodded, fingers laced with his. "Then we face it together." Their love was quiet, but unshakable, like the roots of an old pine, buried deep, unseen, but strong enough to weather any storm. It wasn't passion that bound them. Not in the way folks in town like to whisper. It was recognition. That rare and aching truth of seeing someone not for what they've done, but for who they choose to be now. In May, Clara found an envelope nailed to the door. No name. Just a note written in a scrawl like cracked bone. Cutter. Kansas remembers. Samuel read it, folded it once, and placed it in the fire. The flames took it hungrily. We leave? Clara asked. No, he said. We prepare. He began carving again. This time not animals, but tools. Stakes for the garden. Handles for new kitchen drawers. A rocking chair he shaped by hand. Every groove speaking of permanence. I want to build something that lasts, he said. Even if I don't. She touched his face, her eyes wet. You will. But he didn't answer. The days stretched long. The sun hung high. Wildflowers burst through the soil like courage. And then, one morning, the riders came. 4 of them, dust-covered and lean-eyed. Guns at their hips and hunger in their bones. They didn't knock. Clara saw them first through the kitchen window, her breath catching. Samuel was already moving, calm as a man heading to a barn chore. He stepped onto the porch, rifle at his side, not raised. Looking for someone, he asked. The leader, a wiry man with a scar down one cheek, tilted his head. Looking for Samuel Cutter. That name's gone, Samuel said. Buried 3 years ago. The man chuckled, mean and small. Name's one thing. Debt's another. He stepped forward. Clara stood in the doorway then, rifle aimed and steady. Next step and your boots won't move again. The rider paused. Looked at her. You his wife? I am. He smiled without warmth. Then you should know. He's not who he says. I know exactly who he is, she said. And he's better than any man I've met. The wind shifted. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Samuel said, quietly, I killed my brother. Clara flinched. The riders froze. He stepped forward. Not with a bullet. With cowardice. I let him take my place. Let him die in a fight I should have stood in. Scarface tilted his head. I lived in his name because I thought it was nobler than mine. I was wrong. He set the rifle down on the porch boards. Slowly. Deliberately. You want to shoot me? Then know what you're shooting. Not a killer. Not a liar. Just a man who finally found a place he didn't want to run from. Clara's breath trembled in her throat. Silence cracked like glass in the air. Then the second rider, younger, eyes uncertain, muttered, This ain't what we came for. Scarface scowled. It's gold, boy. What did you think it'd be? Samuel turned to Clara, and for a breathless instant, everything else faded. I'm not afraid anymore, he said. Neither was she. The younger rider lowered his gun. Another followed. Scarface cursed, spit, and rode off alone. The rest followed. Just like that, it was over. No blood. No fire. Just the soft hush of a world refusing to burn. Samuel looked at Clara, hands trembling, heart wide open. I told you I'd stay, he said. She stepped into his arms. And I told you I'd believe. That evening, they walked the land they'd worked all spring. The garden beds ready. The cabin roof patched. The air warm and full of promise. As the sun dipped low, Samuel turned to her. There's a place I want to build, he said. Down by the creek. Big enough for more than 2. She smiled, eyes shining. You thinking of children? He nodded. And peace. And legacy. She kissed his cheek, slow and sure. Then we'll build it. Together. The sky turned rose-colored. The first fireflies blinked in the grass. And the snow, at last, was only a memory. Dear listener, if you've made it this far, then your heart, like Clara's, knows the quiet power of truth, of choosing to stay, of forgiving what once was. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder or flame. Sometimes it's a man at your door, half dead and silent, who sees you not as broken but brave. And sometimes, just sometimes, a name once lost is found again in the arms of someone who never asked for it, but guarded it like gold. If this story stirred something in you, tell me where you're watching from. Like, comment, subscribe, and remember, when the snow melts, what remains is what was always real. Even in the Wild West, the truest thing we can build is home.